much for the introduction. As you mentioned, my name is Charron. I'm an MA student here in the Department of Geography at the University of Kansas, and I'm going to be presenting on a topic that I've been dealing with for a few years now, beginning in 2008-2009, as I was a Fulbright student in Crimea, in Ukraine, and continuing through with my current research as a master's student. So, the Common Peninsula, Crimean Regional Identity in post-Soviet Crimea. You see a map of it here. I just want to give a quick background on Crimea for those who may not be familiar with it, where it is, what it is. Crimea is a peninsula in southern Ukraine. You can see on the map here. It is also barely a peninsula. It connects to the Ukrainian mainland by a land here called the Pinnacle. Over here you can see it barely does not touch Russia. It misses Russia by about as much as it is connected to Ukraine, and hence is practically an island. It is often conceived of in many ways, as you might see in the presentation here. It is also an autonomous republic of Ukraine currently. It's Ukraine's only autonomous republic. And the ethnic demographics in Crimea are this way: 60% of the population is Russian, roughly, 25% Ukrainian, 12% Crimean Tatar, which is an indigenous Turkic-speaking Muslim group found in Crimea, and the remaining 3% is made up by various ethnic groups, including Greeks, Germans, Armenians, Bulgarians, Bulgarians, etc. It is the only region of Ukraine that where the population is, where a majority of the population is Russian. There are many Russians in Ukraine as a whole, but only in Crimea do they make up the majority. A little more background on the history of Crimea, the relevant points to what I'll be talking about. Prior to the Russian period in Crimea, Crimea was a protectorate of the Ottoman Empire because it's had a similar population, a Turkic population, a Muslim population. It was incorporated into the Ottoman sphere. It was conquered by the Russian Empire in 1783 and brought into the Russian Empire, at which point waves of Russian and other Slavic settlers were sent there and promptly made the peninsula a very Russian character. Simultaneously, many of the indigenous Crimean Tatars there fled for Turkey, Romania, and other places. 1853 to 1856 saw the Crimean War between Russia and on one side and the Ottoman Empire, France, and England on the other side for power in the region, in the Black Sea region. Much of the fighting happened in Crimea, particularly in and around the city of Sevastopol. 1941, 1944, obviously World War II, saw German occupation of Crimea, and also heavy fighting in and around Sevastopol, making one of the 12 hero cities of the Soviet Union following the war, as well as the city of Kerch in eastern Crimea. Crimea is two of these hero cities. Following the German occupation and the recapture of Crimea by Soviet forces, every last single Crimean Tatar in 1944 was rounded up systematically and deported to primarily to Central Asia, to Uzbekistan, but to other points as well. This was done because Stalin had accused them of collaboration with the Nazi forces that had been there during the occupation. And it's one of a number of ethnic minorities in the Soviet Union that had been systematically deported. It is the largest single ethnic group to have undergone such deportation in the Soviet Union at this time. It's also important to note that about approximately 42% of the population of Crimean Tatars died en route to their exile in Central Asia primarily. So following the loss of the Crimean Tatars in Crimea, which previously had been an autonomous republic within the Russian portion of the Soviet Union, it now had basically a Russian character without this large ethnic minority, and hence Crimea lost its autonomous status in 1945 and became merely an oblast, or the basic non-autonomous territorial unit within the Soviet Union. 9 years later, following that, in 1954, Crimea, the Crimean Oblast at this point, was transferred from the Russian portion of the Soviet Union to the Ukrainian SSSR. At the time, it was done with not a lot of fanfare, as these kind of administrative reshiftings were quite commonplace in the Soviet Union. It was billed as a gift from Russia to its little brothers, the Ukrainians, on the 300th anniversary of the Treaty of Pereyaslav, which was the treaty that decided as first bringing Russians and Ukrainians under one territorial rule. So at the time, it meant very little to the people who lived there. It was still within the Soviet Union. It just, the chain of command went through Kiev instead of directly to Moscow. And at the time, it passed without it even being on most people's radars. Beginning in 1988, in the perestroika era, near the end of the Soviet period, the Crimean Tatars were finally allowed to begin returning. This didn't happen in earnest until about 1991, after Ukrainian independence, but it started to trickle back in the late 80s. And then immediately before independence, well, a few months before, in February of 1991, a referendum was held to reinstate the autonomous status of Crimea, this time within the Ukrainian SSR, which did pass and regained its autonomy. It's the only such referendum in the Soviet period to have occurred on regional autonomy. Then, of course, at the end of 1991, Ukraine becomes independent, with Crimea as an autonomous republic of an independent Ukraine, which caught many there, especially the Russians, who, as we know, make up the majority, caught them off guard, because suddenly they find themselves in a country that they, until only recently, had never even been a part of, had never really associated themselves with. And so suddenly they had to accept the fact that they were no longer citizens of the Soviet Union, and not even of Russia, but of Ukraine. And there were many fears at the time that this was going to lead to some sort of ethnic conflict, like there had been in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Nagorno-Karabakh, Transnistria, and some other autonomous and unique regions within the Soviet Union. Luckily, it managed to stave off any sort of serious conflict, and the terms of its autonomy were painfully and slowly negotiated throughout the 90s, and they were able to come up with something that both sides could work with, the Ukrainian authorities and Crimean authorities. So I deal with identity in Crimea particularly, and the way people there think about themselves vis-a-vis Crimea itself and their ethnic heritage, their ethnic identity. So Crimea means many things to many people. It's a very unique place, both in its physical features, its geography, its climate, and in the way people have conceived of it through the years. You see some examples here of the landscape, very mountainous in the southern parts, many cave cities such as this one, home to a number of ancient civilizations that have come through throughout the years. Even before the Crimean Tatars, you have Scythians, Khazars, the Goths were there for a while, and many numbers of groups came through. For Crimean Tatars, it's their homeland. It is the place that they are from, specifically Crimea, that is regarded for them as their homeland and home of their Muslim heritage, for one. For many people both in Crimea and without, those who like to come to visit, of which there are millions every year, Crimea is a place of great beauty and adventure and relaxation, with its beaches and its beautiful landscape. And then for many, especially Russians, Crimea is a place of great wartime exploits, especially in Sevastopol. You see here the commemoration of Victory Day in Sevastopol, because of the losses suffered there, because of the bravery exhibited by Soviet and Russian forces previous to that. Crimea and Sevastopol in particular hold a very important place in the hearts and minds of many proud Russians and proud former Soviet people, if you will. Along with this is a strong sense of regional identity that has been shown by a number of studies before my own, which deals with the same topic. This one, done in 1999, shows, compares age groups, 16 and 20, age group 16 and 20, and 21 to 30, asks them the question, what do you consider yourself to be? You see for both age groups, resident of Crimea comes in very high, highest among 16 to 20-year-olds, second highest among 21 to 30-year-olds. By the way, a very significant number, identified first and foremost as somebody from Crimea instead of their ethnicity, the Russian, Ukrainian, Crimean Tatar, Soviet person, etc. Also, the question, what do you consider your homeland? In both categories, we see that Crimea is the majority, a very large majority in age 16 to 20, 67%, 47% still quite a high number for ages 21 to 30. So this is, I think, this unique status of Crimea, the fact that it is a place that's conceived of as being very unique for its landscape and its culture and its heritage, is reflected very strongly in the people who live there, and there's a very strong attachment. And this is kind of the point that I've started from when looking at the issues of identity here, vis-a-vis Crimea itself and national ethnic identity. More broadly, I've looked at identity in autonomous regions of Russia and the former Soviet Union in general. This is a study done by Questionnaires in 2008 that shows the salience of social identities in various Russian autonomous republics. We have a handful of autonomous republics within the Russian Federation: Bashkortostan, Karelia, Komi, Yakutia, and Tatarstan. We see the different types of social identities presented in this study: ethnic identity, national identity, and regional identity. Within all these autonomous republics, regional identity is the most salient. In other words, people feel most attached to their region specifically, rather than to their ethnic group or to the state as a whole, as to Russia in this case. And if you compare that to Russia as a whole, the ethnic identity comes out being the most salient form. So this is a trend we see across the former Soviet space. In these regions that, in this case, are given autonomy, usually for the fact that there are ethnic minorities there. In the case of Crimea, it's a little different. There is an ethnic minority there, but its autonomy was reinstated in 1991 at a time before that ethnic minority, the Crimean Tatars, started returning. So there's a sense that its autonomy is based more on just a general understanding of it being unique for all these other reasons I mentioned, the culture, the landscape, and all that. And that uniqueness is embodied in its autonomy and reflected in the identity of those who live there, much as it is with these areas. But despite this, Russian identity is quite high within Crimea. As I mentioned, the majority of its population is Russian. It had only become part of Ukraine very recently, and there is a very strong feeling among Russians who live there that maybe they don't belong in Ukraine. They have a strong affinity for Russia itself. There's a sense that they belong with Russia. We have some examples here. Pro-Russian marches in the streets of Simferopol, the capital of Crimea, an advertisement for an international festival of Russian culture in Crimea. And along with this comes a certain degree of anti-Westernism, as we see with this advertisement here for a local party leader proclaiming that Crimea is a NATO-free territory with his weapons ready to protect it from any such threats. So the question that's been interesting to me when looking at identity in Crimea, especially among the Russian population, is how these two senses of identity are reconciled. This very strong attachment to Russia and to Russian culture and the Russian past and a Soviet past, but also this very strong sense of Crimeanness and a really strong attachment to Crimea itself that has been demonstrated in a number of surveys and in my own personal experiences living there and engaging with people. So what I've been looking at within my research is the idea of a Crimean-Russian identity, and whether or not there's a special kind of identity among Russians in Crimea that we could distinguish from other types. So it would, in a sense, it would mean that Russians in Crimea distinguish themselves from other Crimeans because they are Russian, and special in that sense, but also from other Russians in the fact that they are from Crimea. So there's a very unique combination of these two senses of identity. I use this idea, the idea I use when I look at this idea with the difference between Rodina and Отечество, or motherland and fatherland. It's an idea posited by Russian sociologist Sergei Grigorovsky, where the Rodina, or the motherland, is sort of the small, intimate area, the area that one knows intimately, that they've grown up in, spent the most time in, and know well, whereas Отечество, or fatherland, would be the greater cultural area that their people, the group that they identify with comes from. You might think maybe an analog in the US would be somebody's Rodina would be the state they're from, whereas their Отечество is the entire US. There's an idea within Russia and the former Soviet countries that this is very salient, that there's a strong attachment to the local place, but also to the greater place as a whole. And what I try to do is get away from sort of these basic assumptions about identity in Crimea specifically, as demonstrated by a recent article in April this year in National Geographic. There was a very large article in Crimea, very timely for me. This is a quote from that article. It said, "Crimea is our motherland," I kept hearing, but whose motherland? For Galina Onishenko, the motherland was Russia. For Rustem Skibin, Crimea was the Tatar homeland, and had been for at least 7 centuries. For Sergei Kulik, the motherland was Ukraine. So this is kind of the rhetoric used with Crimea specifically is that the Russians are only Russian. They want to be part of Russia. Ukrainians are staunchly pro-Ukrainian and want Ukraine or Crimea to just become integrated with Ukraine entirely, and that Crimean Tatars are only, that's their homeland. They don't see beyond that. So what I'm looking at specifically with the Russian population there is the various shades of identity with Russia, with their ethnicity, with Crimea, that are kind of at play here, that some of these articles tend to gloss over. So in doing so, this is what I've been working on. I have to preface this whole thing with saying I just got back from Crimea on Sunday. So this is all very fresh in my mind. The stuff we'll be talking about is very, very, very preliminary. Some of the results, I've got just one tiny little tidbit to pull out of the vast number of results I've got. I'll talk about that in a bit. Here's a few pictures briefly. Some people filling out these surveys, the questionnaires for the survey that I was doing. It's a nice picture of some graffiti I found about Crimea. And of course, I took the opportunity to get out and see the area, because you can't really learn to appreciate and know a place unless you get out and see it. Right? Here's me hiking around in some cave cities. So these are the questionnaires I use. I know you can't read them. Even if you can read Russian, you can't read them here. So I'll just go over really briefly what's on the survey. The first part was basic demographic information: nationality, age, gender, that information about your mother, father, their nationality, their native language, where you were born, where you live, that kind of stuff. Then I asked them to identify their connection to various geographic scales that they might live at. Their hometown, the town they live in, Crimea, Ukraine, the former Soviet Union, Europe, or the world. And with 1 to 5, how strongly they identify with being from that place. I then present them with a list of various factors that are often cited as making Crimea unique: its landscape, its culture, its multi-ethnic character, the fact its wartime exploits, the things I mentioned earlier, and ask them to note which of those, for them, makes Crimea special. I also asked them to list a few words that describe Crimea to them, just what free association, what words come to mind for them with Crimea. I asked a question about the political status of Crimea, what they think it should be, whether it should remain an autonomous republic of Ukraine, whether it should become an oblast of Ukraine, whether it should join the Russian Federation as either an oblast or an autonomous republic, or if it should become independent. And ask them to identify their sense of belonging to various ethnic groups at different scales. So their nationality and all nationalities living at the scale of their town, Crimea, Ukraine, Europe, the former Soviet Union, and the world. And finally, at the bottom of the second page is a cognitive mapping exercise, which I have to give credit to my esteemed colleague, Austin Thielen over here, for kind of dreaming up and then letting me borrow the idea from my own research. He'll get more into the theory behind it in his presentation next, but just note that I owe a lot to him for this part of my survey. So my methodology, basically, for gathering these surveys, having already lived there and knowing a lot of people there, I've been able to distribute them through friends, the people they know. I did, on a few occasions, just go out on the street with some friends, ask for people to fill out the survey. I had a stroke of genius at the end of my time to ride the electricians or the local commuter trains around Crimea and approach people who were sitting there for an hour and a half or so with nothing to do. Who, as long as they're from Crimea, I'd be happy to have them fill out a survey. In most cases, they were happy to oblige. I also had a couple of professors at a university in Simferopol that I'd worked with before and who have experience doing these kind of social surveys, who really went with this, and I got them the survey. They, in turn, distributed them to students at their university, who then took them to many towns and villages around Crimea and had people there to fill out and return to me. So because of that, I have a very rich, geographically and demographically, a very rich set of data that I got this summer. All in all, I was just shy of 800 completed questionnaires, so I'm very happy with that number. That's twice the number I was shooting for, so it was quite productive summer. As I said, I just got back with all this data. I have barely done anything with it yet, just started entering the data, but I've gone through and looked just at the last exercise, the cognitive mapping exercise, and I just want to show you some of the examples of the maps that I've gotten to show you what some of these senses of identity are at, what people say is their homeland. I think I forgot to mention that. With the exercise, I've asked them to draw a map of their homeland and mark the 3 most important places on it. So, as I predicted, quite a large majority, as you'll see in a sec, drew Crimea specifically as their homeland. Just Crimea, without Ukraine attached to it, without Russia, without anything else. And we've got a pretty good variety of maps here. If you remember the shape of Crimea, it looks pretty close to this. A lot of people I noticed had a pretty good sense of what the shape of Crimea looked like. They see it on signs, they see it on maps, it's easy to spot on a map, it's got a very distinct shape. So many people were able to reproduce it fairly well. Of course, we did this top right in the middle, just kind of blobs, but it's Crimea nonetheless. This is interesting. This is the symbol of the Crimean Tatars. It's obviously a respondent who was Crimean Tatar who wanted to superimpose that image over Crimea. Is what it means to them. So many, just Crimea. There are also many ways that people chose Crimea but chose to represent it in a different way. Here are a few examples as various shapes or images. As a flower, although they did draw a little map next to it. As a block, a cube, as a star with some pounds labeled there. At the top, it's just, some people didn't want to draw a map either. They said they couldn't draw or they didn't want to take the time. So this one just says, for me, homeland is Crimea. And they put so much Identity village, I guess, is the most important place for them. This one shows to place Crimea in a much, much larger context, to show its place in the world as a whole. And of course, we get this lovely drawing of a nice pastoral scene from Crimea with the mountains and the sea, the things that people most associate with Crimea, as I'm beginning to see in the surveys. Of course, there were a number who chose to draw of Ukraine. And I'll get to varying degrees of success with the shape piece. One's actually too bad. I suspect the middle one was traced because that's just too perfect in Ukraine to be done freehand. It's interesting to note, though, that the 3 places listed on that map are all in Crimea. So although they drew Ukraine as a whole, the most important places for them are all in Crimea. Many, including this one, have Crimea disproportionately large to the rest of Ukraine, which I find interesting. This one here kind of circles Crimea to indicate perhaps that it's the most important point on that map. And yeah, you get a whole range of different styles of maps with this. Of course, there are several who identify at a much larger scale. These are all either Russia or the Soviet Union as the scale of the scope of their homeland. As you can see in pretty much all of these, Crimea does figure prominently on that map. You see it jutting out pretty much in every one there, nicely. Some include other countries, Belarus. There's one, I guess not know these, some have some Central Asian countries labeled on there. On this one, Russia says Crimea, and Sevastopol says the Russian city, both in an ethnic and a state sense, Ruski, Rossiyski. And another non-map, but just some words written here. We have Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Crimea is Russian. I wanted to show just some of the other scales that people have drawn. There's a wide variety from their house, with their mother, their son, and their work as the most important places. His garden, I don't know if you can see this very well, just the pear tree, the bench under the tree, and the strawberries. To a town, this is the town of Sevastopol and the bay that it's on. Up here we have a small schematic map of a small portion of Crimea, Nima Feodosia. We have all of Eastern Europe, with Ukraine and Crimea featured prominently within that here. And of course in the corner we had a number that drew the whole world, or the whole place, one Earth. So the range is very wide. But as we will see, with these very preliminary first results, the one little thing that I can pull out of all this yet is that, it's kind of so crowded again here, but the most salient type place with which people identify from this survey is Crimea only. You can see among all 3 major ethnic groups of Crimean-Russians, Ukrainians, Crimean-Tatars, it is the largest one that I've gotten. It's obviously very, very high for Crimean-Tatars, as I mentioned. Ethnic identity and connection to place are very much enmeshed for Crimean-Tatars as it is their homeland. Russians, over 50%, chose Crimea only as their homeland. 39% of Ukrainians. This is perhaps one of the most interesting numbers from this graph in particular, is that I was surprised to see, is that slightly more Ukrainians chose just Crimea over all of Ukraine, which speaks, I think, very, very strongly to the sense of regional identity there and the sort of things that help forge the regional identity in Crimea. And of course, identification with the Soviet Union and the whole world, fairly small, but still some fairly significant numbers. And you'll note that these don't add up to 100 for each given group. This is because there's any number of things in between. Just Russia kind of gone through and coded some things as being Russia and Crimea with part of Russia, Crimea with part of Ukraine. There's some that are just pictures and don't know what exactly the scope of that is supposed to be. So I need to go through and kind of decide where to place each of these things to kind of make the numbers figures that out a little better. But I think this is telling nonetheless that we have this little bit to pull out that, as you can see, our identity with Crimea is very strong. Going forward with this, as I work on my master's thesis with this data, I hope to really get into some of the meatier data from the survey, looking at how strongly people associate with the place they're from, the various scales of where they live at, and with the various ethnic groups that they associate with their own, with all ethnic groups living at those same scales. Yeah, I think there's really going to be a lot to pull out. This is just one little taste of what's to come with that. With that, save the questions for later. Just want to end with this one picture. Crimea is my homeland. Do we have time for questions now, or do we?
No, those are questions at the end.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.